Salvete! In this lesson, we'll be looking at verbs and how to change their forms or conjugate them. First of all, in your notes, make sure that you head this section verbs. Underneath that, we're going to write in English because we need to have an understanding of how verbs function in English before we can translate that understanding to Latin. So the first thing we need to understand is that in English, verbs will only change form very slightly in the present. So for example, we would have the verb forms I sail, you sail, or he sails. It changes just a little bit when we put it in the third person with the subject he, but in the I and the you subjects, it stays the same. Likewise, we could also do the same thing with I give, you give, he gives, or I call, you call, he calls. Let's now take a look at the English linking verb to be. If we start with the subject I, we of course are going to say I am. But what if we have the subjects you or he? Well, if we follow the pattern that we just had, sail, sail, sails, give, give, gives, call, call, calls, we should of course wind up with ams, right? Oh, that isn't correct looking now, is it? Okay, we have a problem. The verb to be, because it is irregular in English, is going to have a lot more change from subject to subject than most other English verbs. So we know that instead of saying you am, we say you are. We know that instead of saying he am or he are, we say he is. So the forms of the verb to be in English demonstrate that verb forms can change dependent upon the subject. Alright, now we're going to take a quick detour into English pronoun subjects. Make sure that you write the following down in your notes. We're going to create a little bit of a chart for first person, second person, and third person pronouns, and for singular and plural pronouns. Take a moment to copy this chart down into your notes. So remember, first person means that the pronoun used refers to the speaker. If somebody is speaking in the first person, they are going to use the pronoun I, referring back towards the speaker. The second person pronouns indicate the person to whom the speaker is speaking. If I want to address the person to whom I'm speaking, I'm always going to address them as you. And then third person pronouns indicate somebody who is neither the person speaking nor being spoken to. And so that we have three pronouns for in English, depending on the gender of the person being referred to. Those three third person singular pronouns are he, she, and it. Now the first person plural pronoun refers to a group including the person speaking. So if I and my friends were all to go to an amusement park, I would say that we are going to the park. In the second person, however, mainstream English does not differentiate between you singular or you plural. It uses the same pronoun for either the singular or the plural. Unless, of course, you happen to live someplace like the South, in which case you might have the singular you and the plural y'all. Finally, a group of people who are not either the speaker or the person being spoken to, the third person plural, is they. So make sure this chart is written down in your notes completely. Now that we have that English pronoun chart, we can look at Latin verbs. So head that next section with Latin verbs. We're going to create an identical chart with singular and plural, first, second, third person. The first thing that we're going to say is that first person singular Latin verbs for the present tense this chapter will always end in the letter O. So what that means is, anytime we see the letter O on a Latin verb, the subject would be I, the first person singular subject. Likewise, if the subject is I, then the ending on the Latin verb has to be the letter O. The second person singular ending is going to be os. So once again, anytime that we see the ending os on a Latin verb, we know that the subject has to be you. The third person singular ending is going to be ot, which means that when we see ot, the subject would have to be he, she, or it in the same spot on our English pronoun chart. A first-person plural Latin verb will always end in amus. A second-person plural Latin verb will always end in atis. And a third-person plural Latin verb will always end in ant. Now let's take a look at some examples and see how this would play out. When we change the forms of a verb like we're about to do, we call that conjugating. To conjugate a verb is to put it in a specific form to match its subject and potentially later on its tense or its voice. So if we start out with the verb laudo, which we know from the vocab entry means I praise, we know that the O on it is our ending from the above chart, and that loud then in the green is our stem. So therefore, when we need to assemble the second person singular, we would start with our stem, loud, and then we would add our new ending, as. So we're just taking that stem, loud, and then attaching the endings from the chart above. So once again, for the third person singular, we would get loud as our stem and at for the ending. Pause the video now and see if you can assemble the plural forms of laudo on your own using the stem, loud, and the endings from the chart above. If you did it correctly, you should have wound up with the forms laudamus, laudatis, and laudant. So we've got these 6 forms, but now we need to make sure that we know what they mean. In this lesson, we learned how to assemble Latin verb forms, and in the next part of this lesson, we will learn how to translate those forms. We'll practice this more when we see each other in class next. Well, later!